Hi, welcome to another episode of the Financial Freedom Podcast. I'm Steve Richardson, a bankruptcy attorney trying to keep people on their path to financial stability and independence through education. Positioning yourself for financial freedom early on in life is the best way to do it and creates a greater chance of success. However, this can be done at any stage through discipline and planning. Certified Financial Planner Eric Brotman has written several books on the process and helped countless people to achieve their goals. That's why on this episode of the podcast, I wanted to talk to Eric about his books, his experience, and the advice he gives to his clients to help them to build their path to financial freedom. My guest today is Eric Brotman, a financial advisor, wealth manager, mentor, and host of the podcast Don't Retire, Graduate. As CEO of BFG Financial Advisors, he has been advising his clients on investing, risk management, retirement, and financial planning for over 25 years. Eric believes that financial literacy is the key to well-being and is on a mission to help families and professionals achieve financial freedom, much like this podcast does. As part of his mission, he has served as an adjunct faculty member at Stevenson University, teaching the Certified Financial Planner curriculum to graduate students. So he's not only a CFP, he teaches others how to be one. He's the author of several books on personal finance, including Retire Wealthy, the tools you need to help build lasting wealth, Debt Free for Life, the tools you need to free yourself from debt, and Pay Less Taxes Now, 4 strategies to help reduce your income taxes legally. So welcome to the show, Eric.
Thanks, Steve. Wow, that was quite a bio. I'm first of all, 25 years makes me sound like the old guy, and it's actually almost 30 now, so it's hard to believe how fast it goes.
Well, I've been practicing law for over 35 years, as you can see from the gray beard. I'm grayer than you are, so
Yeah, but I'm working on it though. I'm
there
getting
you
there.
go.
Yeah.
So I mentioned these 3 books that you've written, but you also have another book that you promote on your website, and I've seen that has a very provocative title. It's Don't Retire, Graduate, Building a Path to Financial Freedom and Retirement at Any Age. So, obviously, as I said, a provocative title. So I got to ask you, what do you mean by that? Don't retire, graduate from what?
Well, it's actually not graduating from what, it's graduating to what.
Oh,
And
okay.
I would say that retirement in the present sense with the current definition is actually a fate worse than death.
Mm-hmm.
And we all sort of aspire to be retired, but don't really know what that means.
Mm-hmm.
If you look up the word, to retire is to disappear, retreat, surrender, or essentially fade away. And I don't know too many people who want to do that after a great life or career. So I think it's more important to have retirement be redefined.
Mm-hmm.
And the way we define it is the absence not of work, but the absence of needing to work. So that if you're financially independent and you're doing something, whether it's for profit or not, you're doing it because you have a passion for it and a purpose and you love it. And it's not the same as needing to work to make the mortgage payment or the rent payment. It's a different animal. So to me, financial literacy is the beginning. Financial planning is a path. And then financial freedom is really the goal.
Mm-hmm.
And once you've hit that point, you're retired, whether you're 35 or 85, and whether you're still working or not. I mean, I can't imagine going from 50 or 60 hours a week to daytime TV and shuffleboard. You have to have a purpose and a plan.
Well, and you're talking about retirement at any age. And
Oh,
once
yeah.
it's not so much at 65 you retire, or at 67, depending upon how old you are, when you are entitled to your full Social Security benefit. It's retiring once you've reached the end of that financial planning goal, once you've reached financial freedom. And there's actually a whole movement that talks about this. I'm sure you heard of the FIRE movement,
Yeah.
financial independence, retire early. And I actually interviewed a couple who had written a book. They're big into the FIRE movement. They actually retired at about 31 or 32 years of age,
Mm-hmm.
and using the money that they had set aside and the 4% rule, and geographical arbitrage by traveling the world, were able to. So now I don't know how much longer that money's going to last, even with the 4% rule, because
Yeah.
I think the earlier you retire, And the longer you're going to be retired, the tougher it is to make that 4% work for you. Would you agree?
Oh, completely. And I think the 4% rule is a little bit arbitrary. I know there were studies done, but so much of it has to do with the sequence of events.
Mm-hmm.
And if you happen to retire in 1999 or in 2007, right before a major correction, or frankly, right before the pandemic, it changes the outcome as opposed to retiring at a moment where the next 5 to 10 years are rosy.
Mm-hmm.
That first couple of years does make a difference. And I liken this to having an orchard. Imagine having an apple orchard. You have all these apple trees, and every single year the trees bear fruit, and you pick fruit and you live on the fruit.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have enough fruit one year and you have to start chopping branches off or cutting trees down in order to make up the difference, you will by very definition have less and less and less fruit and less trees. Money's the same way. Ultimately, if you have to start ripping into principal in any material way, you will damage your ability to stay financially independent.
Mm-hmm.
And I would argue it's much easier to stay there than it is to get there. So once you've done the hard work to get there, by all means, make sure you stay there, because it is an incredible lift, especially now with inflation back and interest rates changing and the environment, the economic environment changing so much. It is a really challenging thing to reach financial freedom. And once you get there, you have to hang on to that at all costs. And I'm familiar with the FIRE movement, Steve.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of that revolves around two things. One, skimping mercilessly.
Mm-hmm.
And not everybody wants to live that way, quite candidly, although for folks who want to, it's great. And the other is passive income streams, often related to real estate. And real estate can be a fine component to a portfolio or a financial plan. It doesn't necessarily make sense as the only component, and you certainly don't want to dabble.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's something you're passionate about, I think you need to actually choose to be in that industry. And then I'd argue you're not retired by any definition other than ours, which is you still have some gainful time left. You're doing something great, but you're not doing it because you have to have the money, the income.
Mm-hmm. And it depends what trees are in your orchard. I mean, you talk about, hey, you have a down year where, like now, I mean, I
Yeah.
look at my portfolio and I'm shaking my head. But I know it's temporary. I know that some of the biggest gains the market has had has been, just as the recession ends. So you stick around for the upswing, but you in your portfolio, in your orchard, you should have the tree equivalent, I guess, of cash, so that if your stocks go down, you don't have to start, as I say, cutting off the branches or in effect selling some of the stock or the principal to make money or invading principal. You have money in cash that you can use to bridge through until the market recovers and you don't lose growth. So would you agree that a more balanced portfolio or a more varied orchard, as your metaphor
Yeah.
goes,
Yes.
would help you to maybe retire a little bit earlier, temper the 4% rule a little bit, and make it more stable, an earlier retirement?
Great question, and the answer is usually.
Okay.
And what I mean by usually is one size never fits all. First and foremost,
Right.
There are three primary ways to take a nest egg and turn it into an income stream.
Mm-hmm.
And the method or methods that someone chooses will be dependent almost completely on the percentage needed in order to sustain your lifestyle and to live with dignity and comfort. So for people who have reached extreme financial success, where they're living on 1% or 2% of their corpus, of their net worth every year, they can largely do anything they want. I mean, ultimately, you can use a total return strategy and have a giant pot and just pull from it,
Mm-hmm.
because your withdrawal rate is so low that over any meaningful time frame, you're likely to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
Then there are folks on the other end of the spectrum who really haven't saved enough and aren't in a position of abundance, but might be fearing some scarcity. And for those folks, instead of a total return strategy, you have to look at things like annuitization. You have to look at things where you've created an income stream in lieu of flexibility, in lieu of principal.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a first choice typically for anyone,
Mm-hmm.
though it is a solution, particularly for folks who are a little bit behind and depending on family conditions.
Mm-hmm.
But for everybody in the middle, there's what I like to refer to as asset segregation. And we do a full chapter in the book on this, but asset segregation is, for lack of a better term, the bucket strategy that we've all heard of, where you have some short-term money, to your point, cash or cash equivalents or something maturing in the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years. Then you have some intermediate term things that are maybe alternative investments or real estate, or maybe there's an annuity in there, or maybe there's private debt or other types of balanced securities. And then you have your long-term money, which is 10 plus years. And that's where you'll have your equities primarily, be it public or private. And if you do it this way, in a bad year or a bad 2 years or a bad 4 years, you utilize the safe piece of the portfolio, you utilize the cash, and you allow the rest of it to sit. You don't chop those branches off. And then when there are good years and there are truly abundant years, you refill the short and intermediate term buckets so that it's like starting the clock anew. So every time there's a bull market and you have some excess returns in your equities, then you can refill and start that 10 years again. So if you've started this at 67 and 7 years later, you finally are in a position to start again. Now you're 74 and you've got a 10-year runway again.
And oftentimes the problem with that 4% or whatever it is that even in a good market, the return on your investment might not necessarily track with inflation. So, you're assuming that for the rest of your retirement or whatever it is, that your cost of living is going to be about the same and within the current rate of return from a dollar standpoint of your portfolio. So every orchard, every portfolio, every retirement package has to have a hedge against inflation. And we're seeing that now.
Well, a hedge against inflation, but also a hedge against taxation. You need tax diversification is a kind of diversification no one talks about.
Right.
We talk about whether you're in IRAs or Roth IRAs. We talk about, your non-qualified assets, but people don't spend a lot of time thinking about how their money will be taxed. And if you've spent your entire life funding a 401k traditionally, and now all you have is your Social Security and your 401k, hypothetically,
right,
every dollar you pull out for retirement is going to be taxed like a paycheck, no matter what the income tax rates are.
Right.
And so you mentioned geographic arbitrage. And sometimes that's living and working in a high tax state while you're taking some deductions and then retiring to a lower no tax state to try and create that opportunity. And people do it. There is a migration for that purpose. But there's also, in addition to the inflation and the taxes, the level of inflation, the level of spending that impacts seniors. And we can define seniors lots of ways, but let's use rule of thumb, people who are retired, people who are of a 60 plus age, what have you. In that situation, their inflation rate's higher than the rest of the populations. And it's not the CPI. It's not the Consumer Price Index. If you think about it, retired folks spend money on 3 things. If they're healthy, it's on entertainment and leisure. And entertainment and leisure don't necessarily inflate like groceries.
Right.
If they're not healthy, it's medical care. And I don't have to tell anyone in your audience what medical care does. I mean, that is a gruesome thing. And medical bankruptcy is one of the biggest reasons for bankruptcy, I assume that you see. So that goes up more than inflation. And if you have the bandwidth to do it, there's also education. There are lots of grandparents and great-grandparents helping toward education because parents are having trouble paying for that because the cost has gone up so much. So if you're paying for healthcare, leisure, and education, most of what you're doing isn't getting the normal 3.5% treatment. It's getting 5% plus. So it's even a heavier lift than that. The one thing we have going for us, and this will sound morbid, but it's that none of us live forever. So even though it would be lovely to know that we're going to run out of money after we run out of oxygen, naturally, it doesn't have to be permanent. This isn't the endowment model.
Right.
You hear about the endowment model of investing that has to be forever. Families have ways to do multi-generational planning that doesn't require a forever plan for any specific individual, because that obviously doesn't make sense.
But you're mentioning about taxes earlier, and just having a 401k and putting everything into that, and then having Social Security, having that tax diversification where, and my wife and I have this, we have her, she's a federal employee, so she has her thrift savings plan, which acts as basically a 401, like a 401k. And at some point we're going to have required minimum distributions, but we also have a lot of money in a Roth IRA. So what's beautiful is you take your taxable money first. You have to take it out anyway and use that, but you're able to leave the money in the Roth IRA to continue to grow. continue to be a hedge against inflation, and keep you financially free for as long as possible, because you've already paid taxes on that money. You're not paying taxes on the growth, at least right now, unless they change the rules. And you have that by having your money in many different things, including real estate, where you're really just dealing with if you have rental income or the capital gain on the sale of the property. You have, which are taxed differently. Capital gain obviously taxed at a different rate than income tax. So you have that tax diversification. So that is important. But
Well,
let's
and
get on.
yeah, I was going to say there are spots where you can put money, where Americans can put money where it's never taxed again.
Mhm.
And the Roth is one of them. So whether it's the Roth 401k, now there's a Roth SEP IRA as of the Secure Act 2.0. So
Mhm.
for self-employed people, that now exists. The Roth Simple now exists. So you can use the Roth, but that's one of the four. The
Mhm.
other places you can put money as a multi-generational family, where you can put money away and it's never taxed again if it's used properly.
Mhm.
The first is the HSA, the Health Savings Account, which I contend is the greatest invention in the history of tax policy, because it's the only place where you can take a tax deduction, regardless of your income, for your contributions, grow it tax deferred, and pull it out tax free. And the claim doesn't have to be same year, and you can invest the money indefinitely.
Well,
The
yeah,
HSA
I
is
agree with you,
amazing.
and I've had episodes on the health savings account. I mean,
Yeah,
there are couple of caveats. One, you have to have a high deductible
you
health
do.
insurance plan in order
Yes,
to
you do.
have an HSA.
Correct.
Second of all, you yes, they can be used for any purpose. It has to be for qualified medical expenses, I believe,
Correct.
until you're 65.
Correct. And
Then
if you use it
after
for other
that, you can take it
things,
out for any reason,
you can, although then it's taxable. Then you have ordinary income on it if it's not for medical expenses. The
but
thing
not a
is that,
penalty.
no, not a penalty. The thing is,
Right.
something like 90% of our medical expenses are accrued in the last year or two of our lives.
Mhm.
Like, it's some ridiculous number. And so for married couples to be able to grow that money,
Mhm.
and then when one of them is widowed, start using that towards the care that no doubt they're going to use, you
Mhm.
can file claims 2, 3, 4 years later and do them all at once if you choose. It
Mhm.
allows you to time some things. The HSA is great. The 529 plans, the college savings plans are
Right.
great. Obviously, they have a set purpose. Although with Secure Act 2.0, even then, if you have money left over, there are now within reason and within limits, you can actually move some of that money to a Roth for your child.
Mhm.
And so that's pretty impressive. There are limits to it and rules, of course, around everything. Somewhere in the 2,000-page bill that they wrote, there are caveats there too. And then there's life insurance benefits that a lot of people don't think about as a tax shelter and as a way to
Mhm.
grow funds. So if you've got the Roth IRA, the HSA, the 529 plan, the life insurance, and then you've also diversified your portfolio enough, so maybe there's some real estate, there's certainly some equities, that you have some fixed income. I mean, this is a winnable game. You just have to know the rules.
And you're right. And you the um, necessarily contributions to the HSA, you would have to have the high deductible health insurance plan. But once you retire, and hopefully during your working life, as you're younger, you're not don't get as sick as often, you don't need medical treatment as often, and
Right.
that money builds and builds and builds. Then you're right. As you need health more and more,
Hmm.
depending upon whether you're able to afford supplemental insurance for Social Security, where
Hmm.
you have medical providers that take Medicare assignment. Hopefully, you won't have those larger health bills, but the
Yep.
money's there if you need it for health, for medical treatment, but for really anything once you're past 65.
Well, you can even use it in a lot of cases for long-term care insurance. So if it's
Yes.
something that you want to insure, so you can take those dollars that you got a deduction on,
Mm-hmm.
grow them in a essentially tax-free way almost eternally,
Mm-hmm.
and then use them for a long-term care premium, which would create a tax-free benefit if you or your spouse needed the kind of care all of us fear the most, which is assisted living or home health care or nursing home, heaven forbid. And you can really grow it into a significant amount of money for the worst case scenarios, and it becomes part of your defense.
Mm-hmm. So, all right, we've talked about a lot of these bigger concepts and financial freedom later on in life. Let's talk about how people can get there.
Yep.
You coach and help people to pay themselves first. You hear this a lot with financial planners and personal finance people, and I'm sure Dave Ramsey gets into this quite a bit, where you pay yourself first, which means the money you take money off the top to put towards long-term savings and investment before you do anything else with it. Now, that can be tough, especially with all the inflation we're seeing, to say, well, it's all very well and good, guys, to say pay yourself first, but I got to pay the bills. So how do you coach people? What do you tell them? And what can you tell our listeners to say, look, you can do it, and here are some ideas on how?
Well, it begins with starting where you are. I mean, anytime you're going to take a journey, you have to have the "You Are Here" sticker somewhere on the map so you know where you're starting. So I think, Steve, it starts with a real honest appraisal of where you are, an inventory. And for married people or folks in a committed relationship, it means having a true, open, and honest dialogue about where things really stand. You have to know where you are to begin. Then you can do a calculation, and a financial advisor can help if need be. Do a calculation in terms of what amount you would need to put away with reasonable assumptions in order to hit a financial freedom mark at some point in the future. And the younger you are, the easier this is. If you're 53 when you start, it's going to be much harder than if you're 23 when you start. That's just the reality. But figure out what that is, and you'll have a savings rate. So let's say hypothetically that we say in a perfect world, you would need to put away 23% of every dollar you make. You'd have to live on 77% of what you make. And you say, oh my gosh, I'm barely saving anything at the end of the month. How in the world am I going to do that? The short answer is you're not immediately. You're going to begin with what you're able to do. And that means take advantage of any free money that's on the table. It means if there's a match for your employer, that you take it, because that counts toward your savings rate. If there's a match in the HSA or 401k or other things, it means that some of the things that count toward your savings rate are excess debt payments. So if you have debt, it almost doesn't make sense to start building a ton of wealth until you've satisfied and handled the debt piece. You really have to start there. But if you're able to put an extra $100 or $200 or $3,000 a month, whatever the math is for you, toward that principle and have a debt reduction plan, as soon as the debt's paid off, that immediately becomes your savings plan. So whether it takes a year or it takes 7 years is dependent upon you. Now, every year, presumably, we get a cost of living adjustment, some kind of raise, hopefully. And you know, the younger folks, and I'm not including the two of us in this discussion, Steve, but the folks who are millennials or Gen Zs, or heaven forbid, Gen Alpha, who is apparently coming up behind them, they coined the phrase side hustle. At the end of the day, there's only two ways to improve your balance sheet. And that means first you have to have a better income statement. You either have to make more money or you have to spend less money. And I'm not in the camp where we should have a budget. In fact, I refer to the budget as the B word, because if telling somebody how to budget is like telling somebody how to diet, nobody wants to hear it. So instead, let's say right now you're putting away 4% of what you make, and you're not going into debt. You're paying things off, and all the bills are paid. You're at 4%. Go to 5 next year. Go to 6. Go to 7. Play with it a little bit and increase it gradually. You can't go from 0 to 60 in a millisecond without whiplash. As long as you're getting closer to that ideal figure, you're moving the right direction. This will not happen overnight for most people. I can't tell you how rare it is that a family comes to see us and we go through this analysis and we say, you are on track. It is shockingly rare. It happens, but it's very, very rare. Normally, we have to tweak some things. Something has to give somewhere. And here is the sort of the zero mark, if you will, on your spectrum. And here's X, which is perfect. You're going to fall somewhere between 0 and X. How close you get to X will depend on your habits, your behavior, your willingness, and your tenacity to do it. And so, you know, a lot of it is behavior and philosophy. The math is not hard. If you do math at all, the math is not the hard part. The hard part's living with the math.
Well, you made a couple of points that I just want to highlight.
Sure.
And the one is the 401k. In articles I've seen and over the years and doing this podcast and doing the research, one of the biggest mistakes people make in their retirement planning is they don't take advantage of matching funds in a 401k. And now they're not going to match dollar for dollar all the way up to as much as you want to put in. There'll be a cap to it. But sometimes they'll say, well, you have to contribute something for us to match it or for that to trigger. Take advantage of that matching money, because that's essentially a 100% rate of return. You put in a dollar, they put in a dollar. Okay. And as you pointed out,
tax deferred. Yeah.
Right. And as you pointed out, that goes towards your savings percentage. So when you say, well, pay yourself first, your employer is paying you first,
Part of it,
at least
yeah.
half of it in that part of your retirement plan by
That's right.
taking advantage of matching funds in a 401k. Not everybody has a 401k or 403b where they're matching funds, but if you do, that's something to look at. The other thing to bear in mind too, Eric, is I'm sure if you're starting in your 20s and saying, hey, look, I just graduated college, I got my first job, I don't have a lot of money to invest, I'll do that later, when I have more money to invest. No, invest what you can. Because
Yeah.
when you're if you start at 25, you start putting money away at 25, that money has 40 years to grow.
Or more, but yeah.
Right. Assuming a 65, an age
Yeah.
65 retirement horizon.
Yeah.
So the more the money that you put away initially doesn't have to be as much, but has, because of the growth potential over time, is maybe even more than the bucket of money you may be able to put in your 50s, because now you have a really good job with much higher pay, and the kids are out of the house, and things like that. So bear that in mind. Bear in mind the growth potential of the smaller amount of money when you're in your 20s, as opposed to the larger amount of money when you're 50s.
I couldn't agree with you more. In the equation, the exponent in the equation is time. It's the only thing that's truly exponential. The rest of it is linear. The piece that matters the most to your outcome is how much time you have. And I have never met a single human who says, man, I really wish I had started saving later. That's not a conversation I have ever had. It's always, hey, I'm glad I started when I did, or I wish I had started sooner. I should have listened to mom and dad, or I wish I had taken this advice, or I wish I had met you 10 years ago. So nobody wishes they started later. I will say, I'll caveat real fast, Steve, that there are situations. I think a lot of financial lessons, because there's no real financial literacy education anywhere in this country.
Yeah.
A lot of it comes from our upbringings, and we learn by watching as kids, and often we learn all the wrong stuff. And then we marry somebody who also learned all the wrong stuff, and it creates an even bigger mess. And so what I mean by that is, if you have two parents who are spenders and they're constantly dealing with credit cards, you're going to grow up with that. If they're both savers and they turn off every light before they leave a room because they're worried about the electric bill, you're going to carry that with you. And if one's a spender and one's a saver and they're fighting about money, money becomes taboo.
Right.
And so having some open dialogue matters, getting some formal education matters. And, I'm no therapist, but I have mediated more than one conversation in my office, believe me, because there's so many dysfunctions around money, and some of it's lack of information. Most of it is lack of comfort, lack of confidence. Nobody wants to admit that they don't know something like that. So it is a complicated thing, and it's great to have an accountability partner. There's nothing a financial advisor does that you can't do yourself. This isn't neurosurgery. You can do this yourself. Most people don't, or if they do, they don't do it particularly well, partly because they're busy and they're thinking about other things, and they're trained as scientists or librarians or astronauts. They're not trained to do what it is that we do. And so, I think it's no different than having a trainer at the gym. And I have a trainer because if I didn't, I wouldn't work out as much. But if I have an appointment with a trainer, I'm going to go. And I think financial advice is very, very similar to that. You find somebody you like, and you are transparent with them, and you interview a few folks until you're comfortable, and then you move forward on a very long-term basis usually, and you grow together. And it's really a fabulous thing to witness. These 30 years have gone fast, and they've been fun and rewarding.
Now, just to give people an idea, when you're talking about the growth potential of starting early and starting in your 20s, I forget exactly what the rule is. The rule of sevens, the rule of 21s, or something that is sort of a general rule of how often your money will double. In that, so people get an idea of the power of, as Benjamin Franklin talks about, the power of compound interest. How that works, and what the advantages are, and maybe a little bit more concrete terms.
Well, you talk about sevens and 21s, and that's really more casino-esque or gridiron. It's the rule of 72 is what I think you're looking for. Sevens and 21s, that's definitely blackjack or what have you.
Or craps.
Yeah, you're right. So the rule of 72 basically says that if you take a certain rate of return, and you divide it into the number of years that you're talking about, it'll tell you how long it takes money to double. So if you get an average rate of return, hypothetical, at 7.2% a year, which right now sounds lovely, but if you were to do that, it would take 10 years to double, because you take the 72 divided by the 7.2 equals 10.
Right.
And so if you're getting 6%, it takes 12 years to double. If you're getting 4%, it takes 18 years to double, and so forth. But you take that 25-year-old with the 40 years, and let's just say hypothetically that money does in fact double every 10 years at 7%, 7.2. And of course that's hypothetical, but that $1,000 you just put away doubled 4 times. So it went from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16. You have 16 times what you started with, and depending on the kind of account, may have been tax deferred and everything else, just by getting that $1,000 in an account when you're 25. And if you start at 35, instead of 16,000, it grows to 8. So it's not a small difference. You're giving up that entire last exponential jump by starting late. It's a big deal.
Absolutely. And that it really brings home and demonstrates how powerful it is, and gives people an idea of that. So you talked about earlier about as far as paying yourself first and being able to do that. And if you have, if you no longer have money that's going to pay debt, it makes it easier to invest the money in your future and in your financial freedom. You coach and talk about what you call financial triage, or rescuing yourself from debt without declaring bankruptcy, which is kind of what this podcast is about, since I'm a bankruptcy attorney. So what is your financial triage? What do you tell people as far as, getting out of debt as a practical matter too, and trying to save for retirement at the same time?
Well, it's almost impossible to do both at the same time. You really have to plug the hole in the bottom of the bucket before you start filling the bucket again. All right. And I say this lovingly, that I consider the bankruptcy process to be the last resort. It may not always be true in the business sense, but for consumers, it tends to be a last resort, though it's certainly an option. When we talk about triage, we're talking about finding every possible opportunity to find resources. That might be intra-family for families that have that ability to do it. And there's lots of examples in the book of ways to do that. It might be just a formal debt reduction program. It might be credit counseling services. Now, some credit counseling services are predatory and they're scams, and it's a horrifying thing. So in the book, we talk about the ways to determine whether something has gone through the U.S. DOJ's trustee's office, and is it a legitimate entity or not, because unfortunately people in debt tend to feel very helpless and they get preyed upon. And so you have to know that the organization you're working with is legitimate, but there are ways to negotiate the debt. There are ways to avoid bankruptcy if you can. And if you can't, ultimately that's where you come in, and you help folks do the best they can. And there is life after bankruptcy. I mean, there are people who've declared bankruptcy, and 10, 15 years later or less, not only are they back on their feet, but they're building real wealth. The challenge is that there are things you can't bankrupt away, and the biggest is student loans.
Yes. Although
student loans are a big deal. Is that changing now? Are we seeing
that
some
is?
of that?
In fact, I just did a webinar yesterday on federal student loans and the Department of Education guidelines on settling these adversary proceedings in bankruptcy to discharge federal student loans. So they are moving in that direction, although Congress really has to act in changing the bankruptcy code for have any real change. But yes, that can be. There are non-bankruptcy solutions for that, where I help clients to deal with their federal student loans without bankruptcy, to get them through it. So the bankruptcy, I call it the last stop on the train. That's my office. You don't try everything else first. But I always ask, whenever we get into this topic, when I have a guest on the show, in paying down debt, I have to ask them what I call the personal finance version of boxers or briefs, snowball or avalanche.
Well, first of all, that's a personal question I'm not answering on the air. Because if I say neither, then we've gone a whole different direction, Steve. All right. So I don't know. I don't think one size fits all. I really don't. I tend to believe that you start with the most adverse debts first. And that means you start with the debts at the highest interest rate, net of any tax savings. So
Right.
you have to adjust for whether it's tax deferred interest or tax deductible or not. I believe you start with the highest interest rate first. There are some exceptions though, and that's when you have to clean up cash flow. So in a situation where you have, let's say you've got a $3,000 debt and a $50,000 debt, and the two of them are sitting there, and the $50,000 debt's at a much higher rate. One would argue, oh gosh, pay the $50,000 one with every extra penny and don't worry about the little one. The challenge is if the little one has a large minimum payment, sometimes it makes sense to get rid of that so you can start applying the larger payment to the other debt. So I don't think one size fits all. There are great software programs that will do this though for you. There's a debt reduction plan and a software package called Quicken that folks use for personal finance. It's inexpensive. It's a really, really great program. It actually will print payment coupons out for you and show you exactly what you have to put to each one to get there. And it'll model it for you. What if I put an extra $100 a month in? What do I do? You know, lots of people round it and they pay round numbers to each debt, or they have a $2,000 worth of debt payment, so they split it equally amongst things. That's not strategic. Strategic is either going to be improve your cash flow and or reduce your overall interest costs. And that's where I would start. So I would say boxers and briefs can both do the job.
Or so it's, I mean, just so for the listeners that don't know from previous discussions on episodes, the avalanche method of debt reduction is what you described as paying the highest interest rate debt first.
Yep.
And the snowball method is paying the smallest balance and then working your way up. So you're it's like a snowball rolling down a hill where the money you pay the smallest one off, then you take the money you save there and apply it to the next biggest one, the next biggest one. And it also gives there's a nice positive feedback loop where, oh, I paid off one, now on to the next one. So it's a very encouraging thing. But I think you're right. I think it may not be, it may be kind of both avalanche and snowball, depending upon your situation and depending upon the debt.
Well, it depends upon the interest rate disparity and the principal amount disparity. I mean, if you've got two notes and they're similar in interest rate and they're similar in minimum payment and similar in size, it really doesn't matter. But that's not usually the case. Usually something's sitting out there at 18 or 21% or something egregious.
Right.
And, you know, we've had folks show up at our office with, you know, $20, $30, $50, $60,000 of consumer debt, and they're adding extra principal to their mortgage payment every month. And on paper, that makes no sense, but it makes you feel better because it feels like, well, this is the biggest one. This is my house. This is the one not to mess with.
Right.
It doesn't make financial sense usually to do that. If you've got a mortgage at 3% and a credit card at 20, the mortgage isn't hurting you like the credit card is. So it's a psychological thing, not a financial one. If you can look at it dispassionately, and that's what the software will do or what an advisor will do. You know, I tend to think you called yourself the last stop on the train.
Yeah.
You know, usually if someone's in your office, it's already too late. And maybe that's not always true, but divorce lawyers say that all the time. If you're in my office, it's already too late. You know, we've already crossed some kind of threshold. I think that's not entirely true all the time, but generally finding other outlets first and just some strategy and some accountability can help.
Well, I know bankruptcy attorneys who say every divorce is good for two bankruptcies.
Just about.
But that's true. And it depends. Sometimes people come in to my office and usually they don't get that far. I'll deal with it on the phone. I'll say, well, how much debt do you have? And if they say, and if they give me a 5-digit number, 12, 15, 20,000 or higher, and I've seen credit card debt well over 100,000.
Sure.
Come on in. But sometimes they'll say, 5,000, 6,000. No.
Yeah.
Deal with it. Don't file bankruptcy. It would cost you a good portion of that debt just in attorney's fees and cost to file the bankruptcy. Where are you really getting? So a lot of it is the type of debt.
Yep.
It is the amount of the debt. So if it's all student loans, then maybe we ought to talk about a non-bankruptcy solution, unless they're all federal and you meet the new guidelines for settlement. But again, it depends upon the circumstances.
Well, and there's something else a lot of folks don't necessarily know about yet. And Secure Act 2.0 made this more mainstream, although some companies had already done it privately. And that is, if you're a young person with big student loans and you're working for a company where there's a 401k with a match,
Mm-hmm.
given various guidelines, if your student loans are a large enough percentage, and I don't know it off the top of my head, but if they're a large enough percentage of your income,
Mm-hmm.
you will actually qualify to earn the match into your 401k, even if you don't contribute to the 401k because you're paying the student loan. And that's been put into law to try and help those folks who come out and they're so far behind the eight ball, they must pay their student loan, which means they're giving up the company match. And now that's not necessarily true. And that's a nice outcome from this legislation.
Yes, absolutely. And again, going back to that 25-year-old fresh out of school,
Yep.
huge student debt, you're just starting to pay it down. And by being able to get that match without a contribution, you're already putting it aside and getting the maximum growth for it.
That's
Now,
right.
you'll end up paying taxes on it when it comes out, but you're getting maximum growth and you're starting now. And hopefully, when you're older and the student loans are more in control, then you'd have a better, be able to put aside more and plan for more.
Yeah, it's been said that it's far better to have a tax problem than an income problem.
Yeah.
And that's basically true. Tax problems are annoying. Income problems can be devastating. So you can work with a tax problem. There are solutions and strategies and things that are perfectly legal if you're willing to do some of the planning.
Yeah.
An income problem either means you got to work a lot more, or suddenly you're working 2 and 3 jobs just to pay the bills, and that's not. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It certainly does, but that's no one's first choice.
And there are ways, and there are other episodes of the podcast that talk about this. If you're able to disconnect money from time,
Mm-hmm.
where your side hustle is not, you're not working 80, 100 hours a week between your jobby job and your side hustle, where you have a passive stream of income or way to make money that's disconnected from time,
Yeah.
then that can help.
Yeah. Well, passive income in and of itself is a magic thing.
Mhm.
I mean, that's you talk about the orchard. Those are magic beans. They just keep growing. And so, if you can find ways to get passive income, whether it's in an investment or whether it's in real estate or whether it's in some form of business, some businesses have that kind of income stream with retainers or renewals or ongoing revenue. It's a big deal. It's so much better than waking up January 1st and saying, all right, I'm at zero for the new year, which is where most folks are.
Yeah. So, tell us about, I have some information on you and I'll put in the show notes.
Great.
As far as your website, brotmanmedia.com. You're
Yep.
on LinkedIn and you're on Twitter. Are there any other resources? You talk about your books or
Yeah, there's
websites. How can people contact you? What kind of resources can they get from you and how can you help them?
Great question. Brotmanmedia.com is a great place to start. It's a place to see the podcast and find our financial literacy courses, some of which are free, and some of our white papers and ebooks that are free. So lots of resources on brotmanmedia.com. The financial planning firm, BFG Financial Advisors, is at bfgfa.com. And that's how to find us if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the work we do with families. But those are the two places I'd start. Brotman Media is where you'll find the podcast and all the resources and interviews and some of the tools you need to get going.
Yeah. Well, before we started recording, we talked about all sorts of topics we wanted to talk about. I think we've covered 2 or 3 of them. So I'm sure I'd love to have you back on another episode to talk about some of this other stuff and ways you help people. But a lot of great information today. Thanks, Eric, for coming on the show. And people want to reach out to Eric, go to the show notes at podcast.richardsonlawoffices.com and click away to talk to him.
Thanks for having me, Steve. This has been fun.
Yeah, absolutely.